Jodi Dean wanted to come here and launch a book and bring people into discussion around it. As you'll have seen outside, just a small sample of books that Jodi has written. I think I saw it was Crowds and Power out there, and The Communist Horizon, there's Comrade, an essay on political belonging. You can see a kind of theme of writing into, the left and notions of the party and solidarity and what it means to be a communist after that communism went, and so on. And of course, the book that's being discussed and thought about tonight, the latest book, Capital's Grave, Neofeudalism and the New Class Struggle. And particularly delighted that we have this event here, kind of within the parameters of the London Critical Theory Summer School, because I think some of these thoughts on neo-feudalism and the tenor of contemporary techno-infused service-oriented capitalism were brought out and trialled at the Critical Theory Summer School. Was it two years ago? And so, maybe some of that feedback and some of that discussion has contributed. I do remember some really robust exchanges between you and Etienne Balibar around certain questions, and really engrossed sessions. And Jodi was also here to deliver the Amel Melbourne lecture as well, so another sort of large public forum as part of that event. So it's fantastic to see the book in the world, and even more excellent to have this array of speakers to discuss and debate it. So I'll quickly introduce them. It's Ashok. Ashok's going first, apparently. Dr. Ashok Kumar, who's a colleague of mine here at Birkbeck and also actually a comrade of mine on the board of Historical Materialism, scholar of political economy. He wrote a multiply award-winning book on monopsony, capitalism, power and production in the twilight of the sweatshop age, which had many of us ingenues rushing to the dictionary to find out what monopsony was, and delighted to discover there was a word for the apparent opposite of monopoly, market condition in which there's only one buyer. But to know more about monopsony capitalism, we need to read Ashok's work, which is very brilliant. He's also fantastic, good value on Sky News, GB News, LBC, whenever they want a really angry American voice to get the blood pressure of the British public up. They call on him, and he is great. I love it. So thank you for being here. He'll be followed by Dr. Camille Barbagallo, who is Chief of Operations at the European Legal Support Centre, as well as feminist activist and researcher who's thought a lot about reproduction of labour power and who's worked across Marxism and feminism, gender and black studies, worked together with Silvia Federici on care work and the commons. And I think is as much a theorist and analyst of political movements as an activist in radical social movements, including a movement that was focused on ending mandatory detention of asylum seekers and was operative in campaigns to close refugee camps in Australia, where she lived previously. So thank you for being here. And the last speaker from the panel will be Professor James Martel from San Francisco State University, where he's in the Department of Political Science. One of the things James has written about that I was reading into is the figure of the anarchist prophet, who is trying to bring back sort of power or authority to the community, and in doing that has to render themselves obsolete so they don't become anarchist themselves. And that sent me to the dictionary again, because anarchist, I never thought, well, what's the archist bit of the anarchist? And yeah, it's some sort of synonym of hierarchy. So it's good to have your vocabulary expanded. It's the notion of domination by an individual or group, and controlled by a ruling class. So he has been thinking through ways in which one can exercise power without that sort of exercise of power. So all very brilliant and exciting stuff. Jodi's going to speak for 15 to 20 minutes. Then our panelists will respond. Then there's been a request to go straight out to you for questions. And then Jodi will respond to questions in batches and respond to the panel's comments at that point. So over to you, Jodi. Thank you.
Esther, I also want to thank Mario Aristodemou and Elia Natswani for all the work in putting this together, and for the panelists for their time and for coming out. It's really exciting for me to launch the book here at Birkbeck at the summer school, because some of the ideas were developed actually in person in one of the sessions, but also in the COVID session that was held online. And I really benefited in working these out from the kind of creative generosity of what's created here by Esther and Jacqueline and all the students, and the insights that people brought together. So I'm happy to be able to now try to bring the book in its full form here. Of course, we have to pay attention to the context that we're in today, with over 630 days of Israel's genocide against the Palestinians, with over 56,000 reported deaths, now acknowledged as a gross undercount of the hundreds of thousands who have been so brutally massacred, as world leaders either stand by or offer active support. And this is, of course, in the context of the Nakba and over 75 years of occupation, forced displacement, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing. I said that leaders are standing by or offering support. I emphasize leaders here because we've also seen hundreds of millions of people protesting in solidarity with Palestine. Some are engaging in civil disobedience, even as their governments try to declare these acts as some kind of domestic terrorism. Artists and performers are censured, subjected to various forms of prosecution for speaking out, even as the people are with them in chanting Free Palestine and death to the IDF, as we saw this weekend at Glastonbury. Turning to the U.S., how's this? Can you still hear me in the back? Yeah, okay, so turning to the U.S. context, what we've been seeing are major attacks on higher education, the withdrawal of millions in federal research grants, firings and forced resignations of university presidents, capitulation to the Trump administration's demands to dismantle the DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion offices, which have always been really mild and liberal solutions, but even these are too much. There's been calls for those to be dismantled, as well as programs in Middle Eastern and Africana studies. More U.S. contexts include the illegal kidnappings and deportations of U.S. citizens and green card holders, of students who've been active in the struggle against the genocide. We've seen the dismantling of parts of the U.S. federal bureaucracy, particularly those dedicated to research, culture, knowledge production, the maintenance or guarantee of whatever minimal civil rights we have, as well as protections for the least well-off. And then, to use maybe one of the cruder things that's been going on, we've got the relatively shocking conflict of interest in the whole Trump cryptocurrency operation, where Trump is using his power, and we're also saying we've got the cryptocurrency stuff, which is just weird, right? Like the family's profiting off of this. And then we also have Trump using his power to force law firms to actually give him millions in free labor and donate to his upcoming presidential library. And law firms are capitulating. And then finally, one last bit, We have this enhancement of billionaire power with this strange, big, beautiful bill that's going forward, which benefits incredibly the kind of billionaire class or the richest of the rich, which it will result in the more and more, so tax cuts that benefit them, as well as cuts to Medicaid, various other kinds of provisions for the poor and least well off. And it's basically a direct political grab on the social surplus that sacrifices the elderly, people with various kinds of disabilities, and all working people. So in sum, just to look at, and that's just like the last month or two, right? Just sort of in sum, our present is characterized by a dramatic breakdown between public and private interest, or between what's legal and what would have been and we thought was grossly illegal. And these are aspects of what I talk about in Capital's Grave as the parcelization of sovereignty. And I get this term, parcelization of sovereignty, from Perry Anderson, who uses it in his description of feudalism. And I'm applying it to our present conditions, where capitalism is turning itself into something that's not recognizably capitalist anymore, something that I'm going to try to convince you is rightly characterized as Neofeudalism. And honestly, if I don't convince you in 20 minutes, that just means you need to read the book, because you'll be totally convinced at the end of that. All right, let me go one more sidebar before I kind of sum up the argument. In the US, we have this really odd resurgence of terms involving fealty and vassalage. Now, I don't know, maybe that's common already in the UK because y'all got a king and everything. But for us, like, it's very weird that this feudal language is in everyday conversation, that it's an everyday metaphor for contemporary experiences of inequality, privilege, and unfreedom, right? Like that's the way unfreedom is expressed in the United States, is something different. It's only appeared in the last 10, 15 years or so. Of course, it's not surprising, given that in 2024, the top 19 families in the US increased their collective wealth by $1 trillion. So yeah, maybe it makes sense to use terms that have to do with fealty and vassalage. But an example of where we see like this odd language coming from or appearing, the New York Times, in an article in like their fashion section, they ran an article that was talking about the style choices of Republican women. And it said that the Republican women are dressing in a particular way to show their fealty to the Trump administration. Their sartorial choices are understood just matter-of-factly in the New York Times as particular political displays of fealty. Another example, right after Trump was elected, there were tons of articles about, over the next month or two, about how the tech lords were going to Mar-a-Lago, that's his place in Florida, to kiss the ring or bend the knee, right? So we've got all these descriptions that fit with a feudal landscape now being used in the contemporary US. It's part of the air we breathe. It's part of the description of the Trump administration, but he didn't usher it in, right? He's just a symptom of it. And in fact, they're, as I mentioned, that they've been around for roughly 10 or 15 years, and they've come in, it seems, primarily through tech, right? Through big tech, the language of digital serfs, tech lords, and this makes sense. Right? It makes sense because when we are in these digital environments like Amazon or on Google or Facebook, we're in their terrain, right? That's their property, their land. These are not public spaces. They're private spaces, and the platform lords always get their cut. So it's not surprising then that we would start to see this and that tech would be a kind of early place for it. But you'll also see it coming out in the movements as people are commenting on the new experiences of unfreedom that have been brought about over the last 10 or 15 years. One example from California in the rally and the campaign against what's called Prop 22, which was an effort to try to get Uber and other delivery workers declared employees so they would have benefits of employees. The big, Uber, Lyft, Deliveroo, these companies waged a multi-million, like $20-something million campaign to get this defeated. And one of the labor activists in a big speech of this said, "It's fucking feudalism all over again, and we are serfs." right? So it's a language, this feudal language has appeared in, it's not just mainstream news, it's appeared in tech world, and it's appeared in movement diagnoses. So I'm using this neo-feudalism because it's coming out of the air. I'm not just making up some term full cloth, right? It's one that's resonating to people's experiences of unfreedom and inequality in contemporary life. Okay, so what is neo-feudalism? In Capital's Grave, I talk about this from two directions. One way, I'll call just for the, to make it easy, like to say the descriptive or structural direction. And here I'm using neo-feudal as a way of linking political, class, spatial, and psychosocial developments so that we can see them as all part of the same thing, right? So I'm linking developments in 4 areas so that we can recognize that they're all effects of the same phenomenon, namely 40 years of neoliberalism. Right? Everybody talks about neoliberalism, but I mean, it's been going on for a long time now. So of course it has effects on us, on our world, on our relations, on our understanding. So I'm using neo-feudalism as a way to think about what are the effects, what has happened as a result of 40 years of neoliberalism. So that's the kind of descriptive or structural element that I trace throughout the book. I also use it, neo-feudalism, as in a more systemic or systematic way to designate a tendency within capitalism where capital's own laws of motion are coming into contradiction with themselves and driving actions that are no longer recognizably capitalist. Right? So we've got a kind of structural descriptive argument, but also a systemic argument that wants to see how capitalism is turning itself into something that's no longer capitalist. So I'm going to say a little bit more about both of these, the kind of descriptive element and then the systemic element. All right, so on the effects of 40 years of neoliberalism, and there are 4 aspects here. First, politically, or at the level of the state. What we see after 40 years of this is a kind of parcelization of sovereignty. And I'm relying here on arguments in part by Alan Supiat, who has theorized this quite effectively, but also Katerina Pistor and some, and others. But the idea is that we have a shift now from sovereignty to suzerainty. And it's one where government of law is actually replaced by government by men. So instead of general law that all are bound to, everything is a kind of contract, an individual contract. You see these particularly in arbitration agreements. When I first started this research, I kind of thought arbitration agreements was just like what rich people did, like, I don't know, like people who are writing like tech code or some sort of important content. No, I was so wrong, right? Over 60% of workers, primarily at the lower ends of the income scale in the US, have to sign arbitration agreements as conditions of employment. So that means, let's say, if they're working in a place and they get sexually harassed, they don't go to a lawyer and try to have it come up to public law. They have to go to an arbitration panel decided upon by their employer. Right? So they're governed by the terms of their contract, not terms of public law. That's just one example. Right? Other examples of parcellated sovereignty and the shift from sovereignty to suzerainty would include private military contractors, also private security. I mean, it's kind of weird. We thought that there's an army and there's police, but rich people have their own bodyguards. They have their own security mechanisms. Right? All sorts of different universities in the United States have their own police forces and police on their own campus that are subject to their specific kinds of rules. So this first aspect is trying to get us to think about a change at the level of the state that has to do, that I'm calling the parcelization of sovereignty. Second set of changes would be class or social property relations that I discuss in the book in terms of new lords and serfs, where we have a very small class of asset holders, billionaires, and the majority of workers are in services. This is the case all over the world. In high-income countries, 70 to 80% of employment is in services. Most workers also in Iran, Nigeria, Turkey, the Philippines, Mexico, Brazil, and South Africa are also in services. In China, over 54% of GDP comes from services, And in India, 49.8% of GDP comes from services. So this is not just a phenomenon of the global north, it's prevalent across the world. So the rise of services, a service sector, and a very small class of asset holders I'm thinking about as new lords. Third set of changes have to do with the spatiality of neo-feudalism. And here I'm drawing from Phil Neal's really terrific book, Hinterlands. And I call this hinterlandization. And it's a way to think about how it's the case that prosperous areas are walled off from kind of surrounding desolated areas, areas of increased poverty and immiseration, right? Disfavored peripheries. In the US, you see this, like, you might have a thriving city and then around it are like really awful suburbs, or these areas of abandonment that will be sites for call centers, Amazon distribution centers, and then just lots and lots of abandoned strip malls. You have these within cities, but also between cities and their countryside. So this hinterlandization is part of the contemporary neo-feudalism. Then finally, the fourth set of changes that I analyze as part of neo-feudalism have to do with the affect of neo-feudalism. And a lot of this came from discussions here where I was pushed to talk about, well, I was asked, what is the subject of neo-feudalism? I'm like, well, there's not a subject, right? In fact, if we think about this more psychoanalytically, neo-feudalism is characterized by a kind of foreclosure or eclipse of the symbolic and the conversion and the merger of the imaginary and the real in a psychotic kind of affect. And so I'm thinking then about the affective dimensions of neo-feudalism and in terms of a kind of psychotic, catastrophic anxiety where we're submerged in forces beyond our control. And Mark Bloch describes the mentality and the vibe of feudalism as this submerging in forces beyond our control. I mean, it makes sense, right? Climate change is real, right? So it's not that we feel this way just because we are like mixed up. It's like we're mixed up because the reality is this world, right? Our conditions are such that we end up in a kind of psychotic, anxious environment where, and the larger features of this affective environment include a rising shamelessness, our sense of dependence, and a generalized fragmentation. Okay, so neo-feudalism then is a descriptor or a term that links these four developments, right? These four elements of the present in a single formation. Now let me say something about the systemic or systematic tendency within capitalism that I think gives rise to this. And this is the kind of second part of the argument. And the idea is going to be that capitalism is turning itself into something else. Capitalism is turning itself into something else. My argument is not the same as Yanis Varoufakis, who says that capitalism is dead and gone. I'm saying no, capitalism is there. It's just by its own dynamics turning itself into something else. So more specifically, its laws of motion are coming into contradiction with themselves. As Ellen Meiksins Wood argues, capitalism is a system of market dependence and private property. Producers depend on the market for access to their inputs and to realize profit on their outputs. Consumers depend on the market for access to their basic means of subsistence. The repercussion is that capitalist accumulation compels a specific set of behaviors or strategies, namely competition, improvement, and profit. Right? So this is just generic capitalism. Market dependence and private property compelling a certain set of strategies for accumulation. Competition, improvement, and profit. I argue that we are in a period of transition where the imperative of accumulation is compelling different strategies. Hoarding, destruction, and rents within a general setting of extra economic coercion, privilege, and dependence. Of course, destruction has always accompanied capitalist production, but it's increasingly a compulsion rather than a side effect, right? Investors raid and dismantle functioning firms. Tech startups demolish entire sectors. Cryptocurrency mining operations consume enormous amount of energies, destroying the environment, and make nothing at all. It's like imperialism reflexivized. The same strategies that had been part of imperialism for centuries turned inward. So the economy is one of predation, rents, and services, taking, not making, as Brett Christophers emphasizes in his analysis of rentier capitalism. And I expect more of this will come up in the discussion. So I'm going to end my remarks by highlighting two assumptions that I make in the book, right? Two assumptions that are kind of guiding the argument, and then one payoff, which I hope will be a big payoff, and everyone will be like, oh yeah, this is totally right. The first assumption, capitalism is not immortal. Right? I find it frustrating when leftists seem to be the people who believe in capitalism more than anything else. It's like, oh, capitalism is always adapting. It's always going to be, it's forever here. It's just so ingenious. It's always able to do all this stuff. No, everything has a beginning and an end. Capitalism can end, right? It can become something else. It can become something else through our struggles against it. It can also become something else through its own contradictions. Most of the time, it's going to be both of these. My argument is that we are in a period of transition. Transition can last a long, long time. You don't know how long a transition is going to take. The transition to capitalism took centuries. But we're in a transition period. Right? More than one law of motion is at work. Right? And during a transition, the same phenomena can be understood in different ways. Like, we know this in other parts of our analyses, right? Like physics, right? What is light? Light moves as particles or as waves. So physicists can understand transition. It doesn't have to be only one thing or the other. I think it's actually important for Marxists to emphasize this fact as well. Second, as I emphasize in the book, particularly through readings from like Walter Rodney and Renee Zavaleta Mercado and Mary Ataji from Peru, right? Different modes of production can and do coexist. Even Marx knew this, right? The opening line of Capital, the wealth of societies dominated by the capitalist mode of production appears in the form of an enormous accumulation of commodities. Notice, dominated by the capitalist mode of production, not where it's the only one that exists, not where it has eliminated all the other ones, right? In fact, the very notion of formal subsumption relies on the existence of other modes of production. And then theorists like Rosa Luxemburg, as people know from her analysis of imperialism, has also emphasized the coexistence of other modes of production. So what I'm arguing is that in our time, capitalism is no longer dominant, that rentierism, finance, and the predominance of services is generating an accumulation regime increasingly disconnected from making and increasingly dependent on taking and then serving the takers. So what's the payoff here? Well, you know, it's been widely noted that class has lost its prior capacity as a political identity. Badiou somewhere says that it's become fully saturated. That's his language, is saturated. Other identities, ethnic, racial, gender, religious, have entered to fill this gap, even as none of them can name a politics, right? If I speak as a woman, you have no idea what I'm going to say that. Like, what does that mean? Like, you don't know. Politics has to be given to it. There's been lots of debate in Marxist and all across the left, right, around class and identities and how to negotiate these things. But I would also say that the class side rarely pays sufficient attention to why class has lost its prior power. Right, on the one hand, we all agree that it's a symptom of working class defeat, right? Neoliberalism, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the decline and defeat of unions. But my wager is that there's a further explanation, and that's tied to the rise of services. Wage workers don't identify as workers because they don't see their work as ushering in a future. Right? Instead of building a world, right, like producing and seeing what they're producing, like creating new heights of industry and all sorts of wild, crazy things, you know, skyscrapers and steel and bridges and things that people never had. What we now have is a rise of services where the majority of workers feel like in academia as well, we feel like what we're doing is servicing the consumption needs of the better off. Right? We're not building a future, right? We're servants, right? We serve those who are better off than we are. My idea is that we can actually hail, right, in the Althusserian sense, or interpolate service workers as the vanguard of the class that we need to build a future, the future on a warming planet. Because that future can't be one of continued industry, particularly in the global north. In some parts of the global south, industry will of course be necessary. But for the most part, the future of the planet is not going to rest in continuing to build industry. It's got to rest in a different kind of economy, one that we should recognize service workers as actually the vanguard of. Caring for others, education, health, wetlands restoration, and all of the kinds of things that we need to do to help restore and regenerate and protect the environment and the ecology. So my idea then is that we need to recognize the service sector as part of the vanguard of the class struggle, and an appeal for universal basic services as essential as planning and the elimination of private property for any communist politics. So that's the payoff here, I think, about thinking about the present in terms of neo-feudalism, is because it's not just how bad the lords are, but it's because the service sector can be a source of regenerative class power. Thank you.
Okay, let's go straight to Ashok.
Should I put this here? Okay. Yes. Thank you very much. I want to thank Jodi. That was, I also appreciate Maria inviting me to respond to this book. Yeah, I want to start by saying I'm just really grateful to Jodi's sort of relentless commitment to anti-imperialism, to radical politics, and her intellectual work. I want to recognize that, but also have, I guess, a few questions, and I don't want to fall into that, leftist fixated on capitalism that Jodi just warned you about. But to begin, it's important to think about and analyze, and I think this book does this, and I think books have tended not to do this. I'm thinking about some of the people that I have, like the late, great Joshua Clover, but others as well, that thinking of analyzing systems in universalisms, universal theory, understanding lies in the capacity to reveal the systemic and totalizing logic that structure our sort of material and social conditions. What we see continuing in the academy is actually an obsessive focus on the particular, so postmodernism, post-structuralism, post-colonial theory, and so on, while valuable in their critiques of power, difference and particularity, often fragment analysis into focus on what separates us rather than what binds us, and obscuring the underlying totality of capital as a global force. Universal theory, by contrast, insists on analyzing capitalism as a world system, one that subsumes particularities into domination, converting labor, nature, and social relations into moments of its own reproduction. Only by confronting the universal can we discern the objective conditions that bind us, the law of value, the imperative of accumulation, the commodification of life itself. Without this conceptual shift, critique remains trapped in the ideological confines of capital, mistaking its symptoms for its essence. So universality is to conceive of the possibility of its negation. So I'm grateful to Jodi for many incisive observations about how capital and society are changing. The second is Jodi's unwavering commitment to a radical analysis of capitalism, or neo-feudalism, or both, with the explicit goal of upending it, not merely interpreting it. That critique must serve the cause of revolutionary transformation. Her work refuses the academic temptation to simply observe, describe, or deconstruct. Instead, it relentlessly centers the urgent political question: how do we break the system? Saying this, I've got a comradely critique in the lens of Comrade Lucas Slotus right there. It's a brilliant paper. And I want to draw out some of the questions and tensions I found, and that were some of them were addressed already, but I think it would be important for the discussion. You define feudalism less by its agrarian base or serfdom than by disintegration, rent-seeking, hoarding, and extra economic coercion. But if today's digital feudalism centers platforms, then the question is, are these platforms feudal estates or hyper-capitalist monopolies? When Amazon extracts via AWS while ruthlessly exploiting warehouse labor, is this a retreat from profit maximization or its apex? The Marxist tradition is engaged with finance capital as parasitic, yet internal to capitalism. So I'm thinking of Luxemburg and Hilferding and others. Is neo-feudalism a new mode of production or capitalism's latest stage? Is capitalism hoarding, or do the risk-stroke-reward or the cost-capability ratios, cost-capability ratios, cost-capability ratios mean that higher profits are extracted through financial speculation, derivatives, real estate, bonds, so on and so forth. And I'm thinking of, Kostas Lapavitsa's profiting without producing, rather than investing in the real economy. So this is part of profit maximization. This may not be irrational, as Jodi suggests, or hoarding. This may just be highly rational and profiting. Jodi suggests capital digs its own grave by abandoning productive investment for rentier hoarding. But if this is irrational for capital's own logic, as you note, why call it feudal? Isn't this simply capitalist crisis tendency, over-accumulation, seeking outlets in speculation, amplified? Doesn't the feudal label risk obscuring capital's continuities? Uber's serfs are still wage laborers, however precarious. The key difference under feudalism, surplus extraction required political domination, i.e. serfdom. Under capitalism, it's mediated by the freedom of the wage relation. Capitalism's drifting logic remains competitive accumulation, even if profits are derived from speculation. The system still operates via capitalist imperative to extract value. So M-M, money begets money, a shift from M-C-M, profits via production, and this is from Marx's volume 3 of Capital. This doesn't look like feudal lords extracting rents for consumption. The argument, as I understand it, also rests on the claim that financial profits, such as derivatives and buybacks, are forms of rent-seeking. But they're not static. They're dynamic. They're part of hyper-global capital seeking to maximize returns. Like a capitalist, not a feudal lord. Jodi is correct to say that feudalism relied on decentralized personalized power, so lords and vassals, so on. But financialized capitalism depends on a centralized state, so central banks, bailouts, legal enforcement of contracts, IP laws, to sustain speculation. Capitalism still depends on wage labor and market dependence. Under feudalism, surpluses were extracted via political legal coercion, so serfs were tied to the land, paying rent in labor or in kind. Under financial capitalism, workers are still market dependent, proletarians, meaning no means of subsistence and forced to sell their labor power, and not bound by anything like feudal obligations. Again, yeah. So then another question about class fragmentation. It's suggested in the book that it's a kind of a phenomena that happens at the base, but I think that, and the superstructure, but I would say that maybe it's something that's derived from the superstructure. Jodi makes a sort of very incisive observation that the lack of identity around class and as workers is the recognition that work now is to sort of eke out an existence only for the further consumption needs of the ruling class, akin to feudalism. She says that we're trapped in a life of servitude like serfs, were serfs just trapped in a life of servitude, or are wage laborers the ones trapped in a life of servitude? Serfs, as miserable as their lives could get, still maintained some connection to the means of subsistence, unmediated by the market. It's true what Jodi says, that many workers now don't see themselves as workers, but as consumers. But is this an observation of the transformation of forces of production and the means of production at the base, or the consequence of the relentless drive of an ideology that has convinced us that we're not workers, but but that were atomized consumers to erode revolutionary consciousness and solidarity. This move towards around class is also not global. I know it's more something within the advanced capitalist world. You know, we've seen the doubling, tripling of the global working class in the last 50 years. And this has genuinely, and the empirical evidence backs this, the worker has sort of risen as a major social force. Indeed, there was a conscious and deliberate attempt to transform our class consciousness from workers to consumers, and there's plenty of people who've written about this, and you know, Mark Fisher and others. And finally, on the prescription, you call for sort of a vanguard of service sectors as workers, and universal basic services is very important, and I agree with that, but why does Neofeudalism demand that? These are sort of classic socialist demands born of capitalist crisis. If the answer is the same, organize, collectivize, seize power, does the feudal framing add strategic clarity, or does it risk overstating discontinuity? Your work's great strength lies in its insistence that theory must name the present in order to break with it. The attempt to analyze the shifting composition of capitalism is not only vital, but your text offers incisive insights that illuminate patterns and tendencies across the advanced capitalist world and the world. These contributions are genuinely invaluable. That said, I'm left with questions. Does calling this formation Neofeudalism advance our understanding of it? What is the analytical gain of naming it so? And crucially, if the proposed responses are measures like universal basic services, workplace organizing, or even the revival of vanguardism, hallmarks of 20th century socialist politics, then what is the prescriptive utility of framing the present as feudal rather than capitalism in new form? Thanks.
Thank you. Camille.
Hi everyone, really lovely to be here. And thank you very much for the invitation. I thought I would start with a short caveat, and that is I've spent the last 2 years running a law firm that defends the Palestinian solidarity movement across Europe and Britain. And I mention this because it seems impossible at the moment to speak publicly or to be on a stage and not to begin by acknowledging or situating the horror, the terror, and the genocidal moment that we're living through, and that the Palestinian people are enduring, resisting, and suffering through. But I also mention it because I hope that you afford me a little bit of theoretical grace. It's been a number of years since I sat on a weekend and thought, what do I really think about formal and real subsumption? And how does that relate to the labor theory of value in 2025? So let's begin. So after reading Jodi's excellent new book, I thought that what would make most sense today for me is to think about a contribution that tries to think through this precisely, picking up a bit where Ashok ended, on the questions of services, and specifically the services that we can usefully think of as, I think, the work and the labor of social reproduction, which I think is a useful way of thinking about the service sector. And also, I think in doing so, we think about some of the contradictions of capitalism, particularly that capital has never, and the state have never wanted to pay for our reproduction. And so in the way in which that contradiction plays out in 2025, where we now have what we would call an adult worker model. What do I mean by that? I mean that we live in a world where every single adult is compelled to be in the labor market. And that's certainly different to the conditions in which capitalism was forged, right? And so we are definitely in a different mode when it comes to who is engaged in waged work. And so in terms of, so I think that what that means then is this question of how much does it cost to reproduce ourselves, who pays that cost, and who foots the bill is when we look across the class terrain in places like Britain or even in the US, they are some of the key questions animating quite a lot of different political and class struggles. And I thought I would also share some of my experiences in attempts to organize reproductive workers, right? I've spent the last 15 years organizing sex workers, Some of you in the audience might not think of sex work as work, but within this framework, I think it's really easy to think about how the commodification of everyday life has flowed through pretty much all aspects of life. And I also have spent some time trying to think about how to organise childcare workers. So, I wanted to situate one of the debates that Jodi picks up on in the book, and that is the domestic labour debate. And anyone who's paid attention to British feminism or to US feminism will know that there's this flurry of articles that flow across the Atlantic, beginning in the mid-60s, going through to the mid-70s, which, if anyone is a historian of women's liberation movements, has become known as the domestic labour debate. And it tackles many of the same questions that Jodi raises in her book around whether or not this labour is considered productive or unproductive in a Marxist schema. I have spent a lot of my life with those documents, and I don't think we need to go over them today so much. But what I wanted to draw attention to is precisely the kind of context of the domestic labour debate, right? Because we're not certainly the first feminists or radicals to pose this question. And in some ways, we won't be the last, right? There's something unfinished about this debate, and it remains unfinished. Whether or not you throw down with one side or the other, there is something about that debate that feels to me as if it cannot be concluded. And in that way, I think that it points to some of the contradictions both of capital and the capitalist mode of production and the way that Marx presented it in Capital Volume 1, and also speaks to the kind of labour we are talking about. It is sticky and stubborn and messy, and it's leaky, and it pushes up against a whole variety of different issues. It also is fundamentally a devalued space within the capitalist mode of production, right? And so, you know, when I was a young feminist, I didn't really understand why the boys wanted to talk about value all the time, right? Like in terms of, because I had a really common sense understanding of value. And I think that the question of value is a really important one. And I would humbly suggest that I think what the tradition of Federici and Maria Rosa della Costa are doing in the 70s is trying to take hold of this question of value. Not so much whether or not in chapter 3 of Capital Volume 1 they agree or this kind of thing, but they're trying to pose a provocation to the very understanding of how we understand value to be. And I think it's important to think about that when we revisit the domestic labour debate. And also when we think about the kinds of feminist conditions that our grandmothers within the feminist movement were struggling against. Maria Rosa della Costa's meeting was infiltrated by male leftists who came and beat them up for simply saying in Italy that their labour was productive, if you wanted to get a flavour of how that debate kind of played out in the Italian autonomous movement. So you can understand some of their righteousness, right? And some of their absolute refusal to budge an inch on that question, right? Whether or not it's theoretically as succinct as they had hoped, it's a political intervention into a very deeply misogynistic and sexist and patriarchal left. So, but I think what their work and what I think in Jodi's book kind of points to is that we have lived through the last 20 years of people starting to come to terms with what do we mean by social reproduction, and how does that fit within our theories about power and class and gender. And so I think that the other important question and thing to track through these debates and an understanding of where we've ended up in the service sector is to have a think about where women's work is predominantly occurring. In the 1960s, it's nearly an inverse to what it is now. 70 to 80% of women were outside of the wage labour market, and we now have that completely inverted, right? Where we now have the adult worker model, and you basically have to be incredibly wealthy to stay outside of the labour market within a family, within a household environment. So, in terms of this question of the service sector and this question of servants, I think that the service sector, I think it's useful to think about the crisis of social reproduction that has been unfolding since Federici and Maria Rosa della Costa. So they're at the beginning of this emergence of a crisis of social reproduction. And so what do I mean by that? It's kind of a polite way of saying that women got really fed up and stopped doing a whole bunch of different work. That's a kind of like not a very academic way of talking about potentially that 15 years, but I think it gives you some kind of affective understanding that we're not just talking about women being pushed and pulled inside of the labour market. From the 1960s onwards, we have a feminist movement that's able to articulate desire and to think about what it means to raise children and to work outside of the home and all of these different questions. And so I just also wanted to make a slight point that I think it is very interesting when we think about that crisis of social reproduction, and that crisis has shaped and been shaped by the commodification of everyday life that has accelerated since that point onwards. And indeed, the rallying cry of Federici and Maria Rosa Della Costa was wages for housework, right? And so I've sat with them and we've talked through the irony of what it means to think through the fact that we got what we wanted. We just didn't get it on the material basis on which we were fighting, right? The housewife has ultimately disappeared, and we have a huge amount of people who are earning wages for housework. But we never were able to revalue housework so that when it entered into the labour market, it did so in a degenerated and devalued kind of way. And so I think it is important for us to hold apart. I thought a lot over the weekend about this concept of the servant and the service worker. And I understand what we're trying to bring about. If you read any of the literature from the 80s and 90s, trying to think through the relationships that are happening inside people's homes and inside of these direct personal relationships as people are commodifying their everyday life, it looks a lot like servants, right? But I think it's important to pay some attention to some of the historical nuances. Marx, when he's talking about this, is writing at a time when 1/3 of all working class women are engaged in service, right? It was the largest employer of working class women in this country for a very long time. And I think that some of that remains, right? And we can track where that remains and the kinds of social relations that it informs and structures. But if we're thinking about the service sector, there are many relationships that I don't think it is useful for us to think of as servants. I've been busy. It was my one insight over the weekend that I was like, that's what I can say on the panel. But I think it is important, because the point here is, who are we reproducing? Are we reproducing the ruling class, or are we reproducing our class? And that's the point that I think is really important, because it comes down to leverage. If we are only reproducing the ruling class, a strike looks awfully fucking effective, right? And I've got this far without swearing. So we've done very well. I very much apologize to the live stream. But if we are producing ourselves, then a withdrawal of our labor precisely brings us to the point that I think, if my time is up very shortly, organizing reproductive workers is actually really difficult. I'm an incredibly ambitious woman, usually have way more ambition than I do skill, and I rocked into organizing reproductive workers like I've been organizing factory workers for the last 5 years, piece of piss. Show me where the leaders are, kind of thing. And I have here to really humbly suggest that it's really difficult, and it's difficult in ways that are not, I'm not trying to just make excuses in the way that we do, right? Like, yes, workers are scared, yes, they're isolated, yes, they're all of these different things. But there's something about the kind of work that people do that needs to be more interrogated, and I suppose this is where I'll leave it. If the service sector is to be the vanguard, and I would call it the reproductive sector, and I think that there is some gold in them hills in terms of the political position of re-merging production and reproduction, is the thing that capitalism has spent 400 years trying to keep apart, right? It is the fundamental law that actually makes something capitalist as opposed to previous forms of life. So in this way, I would really welcome, and I suppose it's a slight provocation, because I've been giving talks about social reproduction for a really long time. And everyone's like, yeah. And you might even get a 5-minute conversation about the highs and lows of organising childcare workers. But ultimately, unless we revalue this work within our politics and within our theorizations, it never gets the attention it needs. It never gets the books that it needs. And there is a certain kind of victimhood that kind of carries itself through. It's drudgery, right? And it carries the kind of drudgery and the kind of affect that drudgery has into political spaces. And it's just, we can't, in the same way as commodity production is incredibly obscuring, so too is the binaries that hold social reproduction together. We can't see all the reproductive work that goes into me being able to be here today or any of you being able to be here today, in the same way as it's very difficult to see the labor congealed in the things, right? So there's heaps of similarities that I think lead us towards thinking about that sector, the reproductive sector, as having power. But I think the political provocation that Federici and Della Rosta started in the 70s, which is around a question of value and revaluing the reproductive, is actually where we need to begin. Thank you.
I did bring in a nice shirt, but it's so hot. It's right here. Also, I'm going to try not to swear too, but I'm from New York City, and it's part of my cultural heritage. So, from Australia. You're from Australia, so you guys are. So thank you to everyone putting this together, and thank you for Jodi for writing this great book. I just want to, I think what I'm interested in doing is trying to convince Marxists and anarchists alike that they should take this book seriously. And I've noticed that anarchists seem to be fine with it because we have a very loose, to put it mildly, ideological structure. Marxists are a little bit more touchy about it, so maybe I'm really talking to the Marxists. I don't really care what the liberals think. I certainly don't care what the fascists think, so I think that covers everybody. I don't really want to defend the book because Jodi's more than capable of doing that, but I do want to talk about some of the larger implications. And the first thing I want to say, and I really want to congratulate Jodi for this, is I think she does something that's really hard and really rare, and it's what Negri calls engaging in a Marxist analysis of Marxism, which is to think about Marxism in a Marxist way. And what that does is something that Fanon calls conceptual stretching, where you take these ideas that were generated out of Marx's own time and place, and you apply them far in the future into many different contexts. Two quick examples of that are great are, for example, Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth mentions that the proletariat are not the vanguard class in Algeria. They're actually a reactionary class because they're relatively privileged, and it's really the lumpen proletariat and the peasants who are the revolutionary class in those places. So that sounds very un-Marxist, to downgrade the role of the proletariat, but actually he's engaging in a Marxist analysis of Marxism, right? He's conceptually stretching. Same with Mariátegui, who talked about Inca communism occurring 1,000 years ago rather than the future. It's agrarian, it's not industrial. Those kind of things, I think, really not only allow you to apply Marxism to different situations, but they actually enhance Marxism as a whole. And I think that's what Jodi's done too. She's sort of taken a Marxist analysis and brought it back into the global north, but in this new context. So I think that's what's going on here, and that's why it looks so maybe unfamiliar. As I see it, there's really two things, or three things that are really innovative in this book. And the first, I think, was to me the most interesting, is to see how the dialectical processes that move historical materialism work differently than we may have thought. One of Jodi's arguments is that as we moved from feudalism to capitalism to neo-feudalism, we do not abandon the previous modalities, but they remain very critical to the functioning. So for example, feudalism did not disappear into capitalism entirely. What happened was feudal structures and feudal hierarchies remained because since capitalism was formally egalitarian and was about an even playing field, but it was also about maintaining the privilege of an elite, they needed the feudal structure behind the capitalist one to make sure that they didn't actually become truly egalitarian, right? In a similar way, I think that's happening now as we move from capitalism to neo-feudalism. So capitalism is not going to go away, it's just going to change. So now capitalism itself is going to be the thing that's going to disguise the more naked hierarchy that you get in neo-feudalism, because capitalism still pretends to be about desert and how hard you work and efficiency and all that kind of stuff, right? So it will remain formally. I don't think capitalism will ever go away, but as Jodi was saying, it's going to change its form. And I also think it's very important to note that for Jodi, neo-feudalism and feudalism are very different things. In a way, what we're getting in neo-feudalism is the worst of both worlds. We're getting the worst aspects of feudalism, the hierarchy without all the peasant privileges that they used to have, plus we're getting all the horrible efficiencies and brutality of capitalism. So it's an unfortunate worst thing. And so I guess you can say capitalism is digging its own grave, but what's replacing it is worse than what there was before. In a few minutes, I'm going to talk about why we should not bemoan liberalism or miss it or think anything good about capitalism, but I'll get to that in a second. The second thing that Jodi does, which I think is really great, is how she thinks about the laws of motion working under neo-feudalism. So she cites Ellen Meickson Woods, who writes that capitalist laws of motion include, quote, the imperatives of competition and profit maximization, a compulsion to reinvest surpluses in systematic and relentless, a systemic and relentless need to improve labor productivity and develop the forces of production, unquote. So under capitalism itself, these laws of motion led to a great deal of market innovation and increases in productivity. But under neo-feudalism, these same laws lead to a much more naked form of exploitation. Jodi shows how competition can lead to conquest, not just monopoly, how the reinvestment of surplus can lead to hoarding, and how the need to improve labor productivity can lead to deindustrialization and the shift to a service economy. And that's what she means when she says that capitalism is digging its own grave. And I think one of my favorite chapters in this book, and I think it really shows what she's talking about, was an analysis of Uber. So we all think of Uber as just like one more modern capitalist form, but she points out that Uber didn't really innovate anything except for an algorithm that assigns who gets to drive cars. But what's really sinister about Uber is that the Uber drivers believe that they are in fact capitalists, right? Because they own the means of production. But what that really means is they have to pay for their car, they have to pay for the gas, they have to pay for the maintenance, they have to pay for the car insurance, and they get a pittance for all of that, right? So even the mode of production has now become an empty signifier, and what really matters is who gets the money. So really what Uber does is it destroys an existing industry, the taxi industry. It replaces it with nothing but a system of plunder, basically, and that's neo-feudalism, right? Okay. The third and one more innovation that Jodi describes in Capitalist Grave is this move towards service. What she describes is the move from one kind of relationship that we find in most capitalist firms, relationships that are, in theory at least, based on set rules and practices, to something far worse. I think here I'll say why I think we shouldn't bemoan capitalism as a little aside, or liberalism. The only good thing about liberalism, I think, is that liberalism was full of shit. Sorry, there goes my first curse. But that was very important because since it was lying all the time, right, and that was its success. It gave people hope. It made people believe in fairness and blah, blah, blah. We all know that was always a lie. But what happened is sometimes radical people, sometimes not so radical people would take it seriously and take them up on its bullshit, and those bullshits would become real, right? This was a weakness of liberalism, and I think especially in the 70s, you had a moment when the capitalist classes really freaked out. There's a wonderful book by Melinda Cooper called Family Values, where she describes how in the 70s there was this thing called stagflation in the global north anyway, and you had horrible inflation, but all the working class people had all of their social services indexed to inflation. So what actually happened was none of the poor and working class people were being hurt, but the rich were getting screwed. And it amounted to, I think, in effect, the largest cash transfer from the rich to the poor in global history. That, along with the fact that you had the rise of these really meritocracy-based free universities, like City University of New York and then the University of London and all these places, that really showed that maybe this, like the racial hierarchy, the gender hierarchy, the class hierarchy was in trouble. And I think that's why we have this both neoliberalism, but then also neo-feudalism, because I think that what's happening now is there's going to be no more bullshit. And I think the thing about Trump that I really noticed is he is a liar, but he doesn't lie about that kind of stuff. He doesn't promise you anything. And I think if you don't make any fake promises, other people are not going to be able to take advantage of that in the same way. And that's what, to me, what neo-feudalism is. Okay, now I almost have to forget where I have to go back to. That was my aside. And here's, I think this is one of Jodi's great insights. She says, when we move into suzerainty instead of sovereignty, and that happens in the business world too, our relationships are no longer even ruled by the fake laws that they used to sort of be ruled by, right? Like everybody gets treated like shit at work, but you felt you had some recourse. Now you don't have any recourse, right? And what this is going to look like, for me, the model of the future is the hapless assistants to Hollywood actors. The people have to buy their scented candles. It has to be apricot on Tuesday. They pick up their dog poop. They're slaves, basically. They have to do it. And if they make one mistake, they're out, right? I think in the future, our business relationships are going to be more like that. We're going to have to please those above us, and we're going to risk, total collapse of our life. I'm still not trying to say anything nice about capitalism or contracts or any of that. They were all horrible. They were all bullshit. But there was this way you could use them in tactical ways, which is now going to be taken away from us. And I think that's a loss. And I think Donald Trump epitomizes this, right? He's totally transactional. He's openly corrupt. Everything's about him and loyalty to him. He doesn't care about any laws. And I think I don't think he's like the cause of any of this. I think he's just the ultimate symptom. And we're just going to have a lot more people like that. So quickly, just to wrap up, I was thinking about like this idea that, how long that Neofeudalism has actually probably really started in the late 70s, arguably with Jimmy Carter, even before Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. I wanted to also say something that's changed my mind by reading this book, and it gets back to the word archism, which, by the way, I got from Ursula K. Le Guin, from The Dispossessed. Up till now, I thought that archism, which is a word that I use for all the systems of domination that have controlled the West for the last, on the whole planet, for the last 500 years or so, worked through a kind of a capitalist homeostatic system where you had liberalism alternating with fascism or authoritarianism as needed. So when the rich absorb too much money into themselves, you need to have a more authoritarian government to kind of scare off the leftists. And then when you kind of bat them down, you kind of return to a more stable liberal system. It's more stable because of all the lies and all the promises, And I thought we were going through another cycle of those, right? Like I thought, okay, here we go, another, and then we'll have more liberalism later. Jodi has convinced me that's not going to happen. And I think that one of the useful reasons I think everyone should use the word archism is because archism is a generic term for the whole thing. And I used to think until I read this book that capitalism was the one piece of archism that it could not live without. But now I think it can live without that too, right? She has convinced me of that. It doesn't even need capitalism, or it can have capitalism in its like lesser form, in its docile form. But what you will still have, and this is, I think, the essence of Marxism, and this is why I think Marxism is still valuable and important and critical, and I think Jodi is helping us keep Marxism alive and well and helpful, is that it keeps its eye on who has power and money and who doesn't and how that all works. So whether it's capitalists, feudalists, capitalists, neo-feudalists, Marxism allows you and asks you to keep your eye on the ball at all times, and I think that's what Jodi has helped us do too. So thank you.
So now let's go to the audience. Elia, can I clarify, are there any questions from the...
We don't do the online, just here.
We're not doing online. Okay, thank you. Right, yes, please indicate. Yes?
Hi, thank you for the very interesting panel and also your book. I want to clarify two things. This is not to disagree with you necessarily. I'm just curious. And also, I apologize, one of the questions is a little bit long-winded, but so first of all, I'm interested in your discussion of the foreclosure of the symbolic in the postmodern world. So the foreclosure of the symbolic in the postmodern world, and I'm wondering how you reconcile this conception with the obsessive preoccupation of authoritarian populism with language and with the reorganization of history. So specifically, my question is whether we see a foreclosure of the symbolic or just a reorganization of the symbolic universe where the law does not necessarily concede to absurdity, but rather absurdity becomes the law, so you have a sacralization of the profane. And then my second question is that I was very interested in the critique that was discussed on the potential of this feudal paradigm to obfuscate capitalist continuities. And I wonder how you accommodate sort of the distinct mode of sovereignty that the feudal lord represents within your neo-feudal paradigm. So I'm thinking here specifically, and I apologize, this is very theory-oriented, but I can't help myself. I'm thinking of Bataille and his conception of the feudal lord as opposed to, and I quote, the servile consciousness of the laborer and the serf who sort of cowers before death and reinvests whatever excess is produced by his labor into the suspension of the end and of judgment. And we discussed in the last few days the general strike and how the general strike is discussed by Du Bois specifically. And Professor Nadal-Melcio specifically spoke of how the inception of the general strike was found in a moment where the slaves sort of thought of themselves to be free. So overnight, they believed themselves to be free and as such sort of dropped the tools. And I'm wondering if this decision overnight to be free, this choosing to expend this psychical excess that is produced by the ankylosis that is brought upon by the plantation logic, can be seen as a sort of moment of feudal sovereignty, especially when you consider the fact that in this paradigm, the life of the enslaved population is seen as dispensable, excessive, and unnecessary. So I wonder if in the same way that one could read the general strike as such a moment of sovereignty, whether we can see becoming Lord as a sort of reclamation, as something that can be used to an emancipatory politics rather than a description of the sort of turbo-capitalism that we see today. I hope this made sense. I'm sorry, it was long-winded, but...
Yes, Sarah, and then Hannah.
I kind of wanted to build up on that because I was very struck by the fact that you started with Gaza and then you talked about the sector economy. You started with Gaza and then you talked about the sector economy, and you, Camille, did the same thing. And I think there's something about the general strike the Du Bois talks about that puts the two things together. It's a scene of total death, total violence. It's a scene of plantation logic. It is also a scene of a service economy. It's also about servants and slaves. And I'm thinking about that coalition, these moments where something becomes an absolute nexus of capitalism. So something can be the general equivalent, can be a commodity, can be labor power, can be exchange, it can be all sorts of modalities of capitalism at once. And I'm trying to think of actually Gaza being a place like that, and that actually comes from the lecture this afternoon that Jacqueline gave, that there's something about that scene of absolute desolation, where the extractivism, the racial economy of capitalism, the absolute devastation, all happens in one single place. So I'm just thinking about these moments of absolute coalescence, and I was really interested in the question that Camille brought up, the insistence on value. And it seems to me that these scenes, this putting down of the tools, or these scenes of absolute devastation, are actually ways that produce anti-value. And I'm also thinking about Du Bois in relationship to Kropotkin, because you brought up anarchism. Du Bois and Kropotkin actually met. And when they met, one of the things they talked about is there's something that we've missed, and it's been in front of us our whole time, which is the logic of mutual aid among women. And that is a production of anti-value. So it's not the logic of giving something value, but seeing a scene that contains the negativity of anti-value. So I know I'm putting a lot of things on the table, but that was inspired by everything that you said today. But more, to me, the very pressing question, which I think I haven't read the book, I'm really looking forward to it, is how do we put together this Neofeudalism with what's happening on Gaza to understand that that is a moment of absolute nexi of capitalist relationships of violence and plunder and extractivism and violence that can become a little bit like the general strike of the slaves, a moment of absolute upheaval. That's not a prognostic, but the conditions are there. So I just wanted to put that on the table. Thank you so much.
Do you want to pass forward? Yeah, thank you.
Hi, my question is completely not related to what came before. So, but I guess what I'm really wondering is if you see a study of aesthetic and aesthetic ideology as a part of neo-feudalism. I'm specifically thinking of kind of the class symbol of having femininity and kind of like the value of femininity that's kind of a commodification and only commodifiable because of its lack of perceived inherent value. But specifically what came to mind was this digital aesthetic fascination with manorialism. I'm thinking of the trad wife, and I'm thinking of cottagecore, and I'm thinking with Southern Gothic aesthetics. But what interests me is, it's in the Times in discussions about the way conservative women are dressing, which is one maybe like often 40-year-old demographic. But then when it comes to cottagecore, sometimes that's often associated with queer femininity. Southern Gothic is very much associated with Ethel Cain and trans aesthetics, whereas the tradwife is often associated with wealth, and wealth that is this kind of conspicuous relationship to political ideology, in that it's not really discussed about as being political, it's discussed about, it's being related to femininity and family values. So I'm interested in, one, how aesthetics might make its way into this, especially this fascination with manorialism and how that relates to gender and sexuality, but also kind of like the cross-party encroachment of these aesthetics, where they seem to not really be bound to one ideology, and maybe how that might also relate to the spatialization of the cyberspace in general, since it seems to be a very online thing as well.
Thank you. Anyone else want to come in at this point, or shall we? Yeah, let's go there, and then we'll let you go back.
Hi, thank you for the talks. I hope I'm not overloading you by asking my question. I'm just curious about the strategic implications of the theory of Neofeudalism and what it means for socialist or communist organizing in the 21st century. If we just accept as a premise your theory of a transition into Neofeudalism, is it perhaps a little bit too easy to say that we're going to keep a kind of classical Marxist strategy of organizing the workers as the majority in society to overthrow the system? Or does a neo-feudalist idea or theory prompt us to adopt a different kind of political strategy where we actually have to ditch perhaps these classical Marxist assumptions about the ability of workers to overthrow the system, for example?
Thank you. So 1,000,001 questions. You want to take another one to load up your...
Her hand just went up.
Okay.
I don't really...
Yep.
Thank you for the amazing talks. Jodi, I'm just wanted to, predictably go to that climate issue. But we talk about climate change, and I tend to talk about climate collapse. And that fascinates me because there's a lot of literature coming out. There's an expansion in this area called collapsology, which is about the collapse of systems. People talk about, let's say, for instance, the Sudan as a horrific laboratory. It's a terrible word to use, I don't like it, for what happens with climate collapse. And I'm curious what you think about these neo-feudal systems trying to cope with that, adapt to it, exploit it, make it even more feudal. That's my question.
Thank you. Jodi, some responses?
Also, I want to make sure that the panelists also, y'all feel free to jump in whenever, okay? So it's not like we're meant to just be me answering, even if you just, I know y'all, whatever you want to say, that's cool. Okay, I'm going to... I think that the last question, the second to the last question regarding strategy also links in with the line of critique from Ashok regarding does the neo-feudal hypothesis risk obscuring certain continuities, or what's the strategic payoff? Okay, so I've mentioned that there's law people who are talking about neo-feudalism or refeudalization is another term that comes in. The tech people talk about digital feudalism or techno-feudalism. There's also a very conservative account of neo-feudalism by a guy named Joel Kotkin. He's written a couple of books on this, Joel Kotkin, very conservative guy. And one of the things that he's doing with neo-feudalism is he's using the diagnosis to try to bring working class and the kind of declining middle class together in defense of capitalism. He's like, capitalism is under threat by Hollywood, academia, and climate change people. And we have to, if we're going to save the American way of life, we have to get rid of this neo-feudalism. And so he's using the diagnosis to try to build a class coalition in defense of capitalism. I'm using the diagnosis to say, look, it doesn't matter if you defend capitalism. Capitalism is doing this. Capitalism is digging its own grave. Capitalism is the problem. It's not, academics, Hollywood, and green people. It's not the weak state that is already kind of completely bought out by capitalism. The problems are coming from capitalism. So that's part of the strategic payoff. Does this risk obscuring continuities? Sure. I mean, any concept risks obscuring continuities, right? Any common noun obscures things, right? That's not even something to worry about, I don't think, right? It's like, I see my 12-year-old. Oh, is my 12-year-old an adult or a little child? I'm obscuring continuities in any direction. So I can live with this fear. And I can live with the risk. And I think the reason to live with the risk or live with the fear is if you can start to find ways to understand the present, to find ways to fight against it. And I think that thinking about it in terms of neo-feudalism rather than capitalism helps us, because it helps us deal with the problems, say, in all of the debate around Uber and the drivers, when if they're workers, they feel screwed, because they are screwed as workers. If they're independent contractors, they're screwed. Either way. And so just saying that they're workers under capitalism is not going to help us. But identifying the fact that we are in a situation where the exact same things, like platforms, can be described in two directions, according to two different logics, can help us figure out ways to fight against the problems more effectively. So, and Cedric Durand makes this point in the different New Left review debates around techno-feudalism, where he's like, look, if it's just capitalism, we're fine. Our Marxist arguments still hold up. No one's abandoning those. But if there is something to the neo-feudal or techno-feudal hypothesis, then we need another set of arguments. And so that's what I'm trying to bring out. I think we're in a point of transition. I don't think capitalism is dead, but I think we need to be on the lookout to the ways that it is functioning that are no longer recognizably capitalist. Okay. On the, I want to talk about the question regarding lords and this kind of sovereignty. And I actually, and then the description of the general strike. I don't think the general strike makes sense as a moment, right? I think that even in Du Bois, right, it's embedded in a history, a set of practices of resistance, defeat, struggle, possibility. And so I don't think calling it a kind of sovereign act is exactly, I think that's not, I don't think that, to me, it's not helpful. I mean, I think we can talk about forms of agency without saying sovereign or not sovereign, right? Agency is not just the same thing. Sovereignty is a kind of I would say a set of controls and a finality, a degree of lawfulness without content, the buck stops here, or a kind of wholeness or completion to sovereignty. And that's why there have been important critiques of sovereignty that have pointed out both the problems with that kind of wholeness and the fact that it's always leaky, to use a term Camille used in a different context. So with that bit of background on that, I want to say that I don't think it's a good idea to sort of claim lordship and think about that as a model for our resistance, in part because I want a future that's egalitarian. And I've been, it's very interesting in organizing, obviously I'm white, I live in a small town in upstate New York. We do organizing in our town. Sometimes that involves people whose primary social location is their church, with Black people. And they often like the language of kings and queens. And they find it very helpful for mobilizing their young people and say, y'all are all kings and queens. I'm super skeptical about that, right? I mean, I'm not going to go tell them don't organize that way, but I don't think it's one that we should continue because I think it hurts the possibilities for building egalitarian social relations and seeing those as important and seeing, basically, so a kind of more fundamental equality. Let me see, there was, so on the, I wouldn't call Gaza the absolute nexus of capitalism. But I might call it the absolute nexus of imperialism. And I think that those differences matter because imperialism brings with it a lot more set of relations, of geopolitical relations, of territoriality, coloniality, and violence than capitalism on its own does. So that's the first move I would make. The second one is, I guess I'm not going to I wouldn't go in the direction just of total death, because I don't think that it lets us see the strength of resistance. I know, I'm not saying that that's what you meant at all, right? I mean, we can have this dialogue, but I worry that that becomes less visible, and that that's also part of the story. And so the story of emancipatory battle and resistance when there had been hopelessness. I've also thought when you were talking about sort of negativity and devastation, the person who think is really useful on this is Ali Qadri. His book is The Accumulation of Waste, and it's very much about waste as part of capitalist production. Very interesting and and useful in a ways that that I'm not. Let's see. Maybe on collapsology. And like I would put collapsology in the general basket of, I would say that it's symptomatic of the kind of psychotic anxiety and catastrophism that is, it's not surprising that it's real. But I mean, I don't know, it's like really weird in the United States to me that everyone is like, that some kind of collapsology is so strong, some sort of ultimate doomerism. Given that lots of societies have gone through tons of things worse, right? And wait a minute, what's your reality here that you're utterly invested in collapse, given that other countries have gone through worse and survived in various forms and altered in various forms? They may be terrible, but it's not a reason to say it is utterly the end of the world, right? Just because you live in the United States and Trump is elected. That's a very strange attitude, I think. Okay, did I agree?
Aesthetics? Do you have anything?
Oh, aesthetics. Oh, yeah, I love that question. There's actually been one or two art articles that I can't remember the names of where people were bringing out neo-feudalism as a specific aesthetics. I thought your examples were great, and it's a really fruitful idea. I only kind of like throw out in this sort of scattershot way different gestures. But I don't do it. But I don't do it in any coherent way. But I think it's super valuable and useful. Oh, I know. The part that I also liked is like you were right, I think, to say that they're not bound together in a coherent ideology. That's part of this general sense of overall fragmentation that I think of as part of the collapse of the symbolic order, decline of symbolic efficiency, and general emergence of the imaginary and the real in neo-feudalism that accounts for its psychotic environment. So it doesn't hold together as one thing. The same kinds of images float around in different ways with different kinds of meanings and connotations.
Does anyone on the panel want to come back?
Yeah, I kind of wanted to build off of some things that were said here really quickly. Yes, obviously, at the level of discourse, Trump is a departure from a particular kind of liberal discourse. It's indicative of something, but I think there needs to be a kind of clear disjuncture between, and Jodi does this in the book a bit, but then between the advanced capitalist world, the global north and the global south. As a proportion, even if you could look at examples of resistance, let's take this is even a global north or global south question, but look at Yemen, the Red Sea blockade. The reason why the vulnerabilities exist for the shipping companies, and they shut down immediately, and the liabilities went through the roof, and they were able to successfully enforce a blockade the first time in history without a navy, was precisely because the liabilities of consolidated monopolistic capital, where 9 companies control 90% of all global shipping. So that's not a different form of fragmented capital. That's obviously, and that's a different argument, obviously, that's made here. That is a hyper form of capitalism. It is the case that capitalism is digging its own grave, not through shifting necessarily through a different kind of mode of production or an iteration of a previous mode of production, but actually hyper-capitalism, where different vulnerabilities open up precisely because of this consolidation. It's the utility of profit maximization, the underlying laws of motion of competition that leads to this consolidation. Precisely for that reason, their liabilities go through the roof, and they have various choke points that open up. That's just one example, but even if you look at like upheavals that we've seen over the last 15, 20 years, there's any number of ones, problems notwithstanding, but like the Green Movement in Iran, or the Red Shirts in Thailand, or even the Arab Spring, we see the ones that were the most successful. So for example, Tunisia and Egypt, at least in upending the existing political order, they were mass strikes. They took over squares. The distinction between them and the ones that didn't succeed was because of day 16 and day 18, they were able to call a general strike. Now that general strike wasn't, and I'm not devaluing the value production of reproductive labor, or that's not what I'm suggesting. I'm saying that there is still a centrality for much of the world of workers as the revolutionary conscious class. They went on strike and it brought the country to its knees. It paralyzed the economy, and that's precisely why the government had to step down. And so I think it's important, obviously, that doesn't mean that there's not other forms coming in the global north in particular places, but I think I just wanted to clarify that. And also on the question of Gaza, obviously, why imperialism is the central mode of analysis here is that it's not confined to the geography of the settler colony or Gaza. It's going back into history and understanding why the Western powers needed, precisely at the choke point that separated Asia from Africa, precisely when new forms of resources were being extracted, a military base. And Gaza's resistance on October 7th, and that's precisely what it was, whether you agree with it or not, it is a form of resistance, that genuinely threatened the hegemony of that state. So they had to destroy it. They had to eviscerate it. No, not that different from what happened in Haiti in the 1790s. So I think that we have to understand that violence really, and I mean, even now, the mass violence, starvation, the killing of children, that actually doesn't benefit the liberal order in the West. It's actually its own settler colonial logic acting in very irrational ways, but with disastrous consequences. Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that. Yeah, I also was going to come in to think a little bit about something that I didn't talk about, which I think it's become nearly like something that I'm really interested in that we don't talk about it. And I'll watch lots of people's eyes roll a little bit as I say it. And also some people feel uncomfortable talking about this in a theoretical way. But don't you think it's interesting that we're trying to understand the context of the present and we haven't talked about COVID? And we haven't talked about COVID in the context of the service sector, the context of what it did to capitalism. And I think that we need to do some more work on COVID, like we really do. There was some gold in them hills with COVID. I used to call it Comrade COVID at times, because Comrade COVID did more for the question around social reproduction than us feminists had been able to basically do for 40 years. And that was a very humbling thing to live through, that mass death was able to illustrate and bring forth a new subject. And that new subject was the essential worker. Wasn't she great? And we haven't done enough with that, right? And we got played with COVID. There was a moment, and I talk about it as I feel like there were 3 days when I lived through what is potentially what I hyperbolically call a pre-revolutionary state in the British working class. And it's the 3 days before they implemented furlough. And that's when millions of people were like, absolutely, fuck this. I'm not going to work. I'm not sending my kid to school. And people started to take matters into their own hands in quite profound ways. It wasn't just setting up a mutual aid WhatsApp chat to check on Betty down the road, right? There was like severe distrust and also just a real sense of, hang on a second, you know, like, and it happened for 3 days, and then furlough, what an amazing moment of cutting that off as quickly as they possibly could. So I think we have some more work to do with COVID, because we are living through another moment of mass death, but I don't think that we have done anywhere near enough work on the previous moment of mass death that we lived through, nor some of the really stark political contributions that that moment provided for us. And I think that some of the strategic kind of relevance for where we find ourselves today and what organizing in the reproductive sphere looks like. We can use COVID as a very good case study of where some of our leverage was and where we are completely weak, right? And what kinds of other forms of infrastructure would we have to build to be able to deal with those kind of weaknesses? And like coming back to the service sector really quickly, it's also in Britain where a bunch of women threw another bunch of women under the bus. And I think we could think through all of the different ways in which our class was weakened because of some of the devaluation around social reproduction. I'm thinking specifically about the decision to keep nursery schools open and to close schools. Cast your mind back to the public health reasons why my 8-year-old wasn't able to be in institutionalized care, but my 4-year-old was going into a petri dish of a pandemic that was killing thousands of people every week, right? And that basically had to do with the fact that the home became an incredibly violent site. We saw deaths of under 2-year-olds skyrocket across the country, if you want to add some really heavy statistics into what I mean by the home being a really violent site. And actually in the adult worker model, it all breaks down if someone's not doing the care work, right? Because and you watched it in those first few weeks. So even men had to juggle childcare on national television during their Zoom calls, and didn't they do it badly? So I just think, I'm just trying, you don't remember that moment? Yeah. Come on, you have to remember the guy. He just like completely fucked it up. We're all working, and then he was real rude, remember? It was bad. And so anyway, my argument is that I think this service sector question, I think many of the answers actually exist in the 1.5 years of the pandemic.
Yeah, I'll just say something quickly. I kind of agree with Jodi and Ashok about that Gaza is more of a imperial than a capitalist situation. However, I think there's a capitalist side to it too. And I was thinking about one reason that people should care about Gaza, besides that it's a genocide, is also that it could be like a harbinger for a lot of other places. And a long time ago, James Boggs wrote a book in the 1960s called The American Revolution, and he has a chapter where he says, capitalism is making more and more workers just like redundant, so they don't really have a place. And he said, revolutionaries need to think about how to have a revolution without workers because we might not have workers in the future. And I know that there's service workers, but there's also going to be, I think, just nothing. And I think to me, Gaza sort of is an example of what you do with workers who are no longer, neither service workers nor anything else, and are just basically surplus population. And I think that's one way to deal with them, hopefully not too often, but I think we should take that seriously as another threat.
Final round of questions, contributions? Yeah.
Sorry, how was that?
Thank you very much. Can I just say, a fascinating panel. I don't think I can remember going to a more wide-ranging discussion and different aspects of so much quality, with so much variety. It's just really inspiring for me. I haven't been in the academic circle for a while, so it makes me miss a lot. My question is, how sustainable do you think neo-feudalism could be? I think from the discussions, it's the superstructure might be getting a little bit more erratic in the global north, and potentially doing things which are really highlighting new contradictions in the base and how it sustains itself. But with Ashok talking about the world system, really kind of, and it's getting me to think about how does this fit into something different, sustaining itself, if the logic of accumulation that drives capitalism so centrally, and this kind of the relationship with global supply chains under globalization, how does that sustain itself? Does it, when we're looking at demographics and climate change and certain dynamics in the global north, growth is harder and harder to come by. Does that mean that when we think about steady state economics or degrowth, is this a way of managing that in the global north? But if you're looking at a developing country that's still got that development pathway, how does that make sense? Because this was capitalism and feudalism. It was I don't know how long, but over a century of this thing picking up speed, but it was, you know, this thing that drove accumulation. How can neo-feudalism drive accumulation? It's like a retreat. So that was also like this thing about collapsology and climate change. I think it's sort of, you know, really going to be interesting in there. And also, you know, then about feudalism, you know, revolts with pitchforks. You know, you were talking about the sort of strategic thing. Under surveillance capitalism as well, you know, how are we going to get the pitchforks out? So yeah, just so much to think about. So yeah, thank you very much.
Sorry. Hi, thank you. My question is more of a short one. I'm also building on the sustainability of neo-feudalism, but I'm also interested in, like, as a concept, as a framework, the ability that we can use that to take that forward. For example, I'm thinking, like, on the tube, there are these ads of, like, humans with a beta test, AI employees are now here, basically saying we can just replace people altogether, and the human worker is no longer defined by the labor they produce, but just by surplus population. My question is less what do we do with that, but more how does neo-feudalism as a concept, as you've described in your book, give us the critical tools to deal with that, where humanity is, like, yeah, it's surplus, it's not defined by a worker, and so how do we mobilize a worker population when they're not workers anymore, when they're just excess?
Thank you. You can pass it behind.
Hi, thank you all very much. I have quite a short question, which is maybe implicit from a couple of the others, but curious about the concept of the parcelization of sovereignty and suzerainty. I'm curious about how that fits with the simultaneous increasing importance of supranational and global organizations and forms of sovereignty or bodies that enforce things like contracts at the same time, and the mobility of many of these actors all around the globe, including to create parceled out zones and things like that. Thank you.
Mine is very short. I mean, obviously, as Ashok said, you know, the central question is how do we change things? The political struggle is at the center, and it has been all your life. And you're not only an activist, you're a member of a political party. So my question is basically, how has your conceptualization of neo-feudalism changed your political engagement in your party, your activism generally? Because I think we're all wondering what we can do if we call it neo-feudalism as opposed to capitalism.
So I think we'll go back to Jodi just to wrap up, and if you have anything you really want to know about.
Yeah, I'll start with Maria's question. And actually, because your question about how has neo-feudalism changed my own political engagement, it actually connects for me with when I first got to know Camille, because Camille is the person who taught me about social reproduction and social reproduction theory in ways I had not thought about it. And what I first really loved about learning about that area was it seemed like a really important counter to straightforward intersectionality, like much more just like theoretically more rigorous and structured and revolutionary. And it was thinking, you know, learning this from Camille and thinking about this that then led me to put together the book Organized Fight Win, the political writings of Black communist women with Charisse Burden-Stelly. And so many of the pieces written by these Black women from the United States in and around the Communist Party in the first part of the 20th century are about organizing household workers and domestic labor and the challenges of that and how difficult, but where they're also finding you know, women who are heads of their communities and they're moving in and out of workplaces, and that's one place. I mean, is it the final answer? In no way. But they're trying to find, they're taking very seriously work that is not productive labor in the typical Marxist sense, but absolutely essential for the reproduction of communities. And Camille, I think your point about who's being reproduced, I think that's right. And I need, going forward, I'll think more about that. One of the things I'm trying to do towards the end of the book is suggest that service work, particularly understood in this, utterly amorphous way, what's combining care and unpaid and informal labor, that it does challenge capitalist value precisely because it is utterly essential to every part of it, though it's devalued or outside of value, outside of the production of value, and that. And if I had actually not been a coward and said more about COVID there, because your point about we don't talk about it is so right. Like I was starting to work on this book. I'd already written a couple of chapters, and COVID happens, and I'm like, I can't do this now. So I did the Black Communist Women book, but I felt even when I wrote in the introduction about it, I thought it was cringy. And I'm like, why? It's ridiculous, but I felt it was too cringe, though everything that I had been thinking about the revelation of the essential dependence on totally devalued labor became really clear during COVID, but I pulled back. And I how to analyze that, I don't know. But I think he really named something utterly profound here. So back to Maria, I think in terms of actual organizing, it's more recognizing how do we let people see their work as ushering in a future. That's really the crucial thing, and that it's not just this kind of work or that kind of work, but it's building the kind of future that we need on a warming planet. And I want that to be something that all left parties now emphasize more and more. I hope that'd be the best of all possible worlds. In this tiny, terrible world, right? But it would be, I think it would be useful. Okay, Neofeudalism. I actually don't think who knows? Feudalism was not a very efficient at all mode of accumulation, and it lasts long times and takes multiple forms in different parts of the world. And so it's hard to say, how long it could be sustainable. But as I'm theorizing it, it is a form of taking, not making, so it's utterly parasitic, and that means it's not. It's only redistributive, and so it can't be that long-lasting. But okay, so that's a first stop. Another way to think about this is to think, look, neo-feudalism is trying to give us a picture of relations of power with no accountability at all, right? It's just power all the way down. No liberalism, no really centralized forces that are actually going to legislate or adjudicate disagreements in any kind of, world that we recognize as fair, but power all the way down. Is this a way that degrowth is managed? It seems like it may well be, right? That's the wealthiest and the most powerful taking everything they can as quickly as they can, right? That seems also the Israel strategy, right? To destroy everything as quickly as it can until someone in the global community is able to marshal the resources to stop them. But I think that for at least some of us, some of the horrors after 6 months of this wave of the genocide was the realization oh fuck, they're gonna let this happen. They're gonna do this, and this is what the climate future is. That's why the collapsologists make sense. But, it's how is, they will take and do what they can as long as they can until we're able to stop it. So is that a management, is that a way to manage society? Not really, but if society doesn't depend on legitimacy anymore, then it's really just a matter of how do you get enough power to stop this. So I don't think that's a great answer, but that's where I'm thinking right now. AI. I think maybe if you put AI within this sort of neo-feudal framework, one of the tools or one of the perspectives that you might start to see is how AI is part of this, also this logic of demolition, catastrophism. I also think it's a kind of genocidal imaginary of a world without workers. I've also been wondering why in the world would Elon Musk spend billions on robots? or try to develop robots when, like, I don't know, the transportation systems in New York and Philadelphia are utterly collapsing, and there's like bridges are collapsing, and all this money goes to robots. It's because that's a site of dependence, right? Like household robot, like they're dependent on working people, and they're trying to eliminate that kind of dependence, because clearly workers are cheaper than robots, right? Particularly in the devalued condition of the present. But workers can slit their throats. Right? Robots if we program them. People like that one. They like that to be brilliant. All right, thank you all. Thank you.
For your great questions, and thank you to a brilliant.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you.
Buy the book.
Thank you all for coming. God, it's 1 billion degrees in here.